journey to home is the journey to God, and the journey to God is the journey to self, which is again the journey to home.
Guy, we're so glad that you're here today. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I appreciate it.
So I wanted to kind of get started just a little bit by saying, by asking you what's been going on with you. I think everybody knows what's been going on with you because they read your writing, but what is something that you might want to tell us to kind of catch us up?
Well, I hardly know where to start. Some things are lines of continuity, and that's good. Lines of continuity are the coaching, guiding I do primarily with younger ministers, but also with other folks. I'm still doing some adjunct teaching and supervising at Gardner-Webb D-Min program for the seminary there. And I preach and teach when I can, and that's less so now that it's all online. But, 2020 has been a hard year for everybody because of a lot of the things that we'll talk about. It's been a tough year for me health-wise as well. I've had 3 seasons of different things that sort of knocked me down. The most recent one being this open heart surgery I had to have to repair. But the good news is I'm feeling better, making a lot of progress toward getting back to. I'm going to try not to say normal tonight, even about that. So some sort of new normal, or as John Walton at Wake Forest Div says, the now normal. And Anita and the kids are doing fine. Anita's working on the administrative staff at First Presbyterian Church downtown. Amanda's in Florida at Flagler Beach, working with a dance company and in their PR department, sort of. Trying to start another community theater. It's a terrible time for that, but she's trying to start one. And Elliot's in Boston with the technology firm he works for. Probably going to move back to Chicago soon, but they're all doing well. So,
wow, good. Well, I'm glad to hear. I miss seeing Amanda. Tell her I said hey.
Me too.
That's great. So that's good. So I want to just jump right into it today. So let's talk about hope. So I know we're in this weird time where we're apart, and I know when I've talked to people, they're always looking for something to anticipate or something, as you said, normal, something we want to go back to, and they're struggling with the now. So I don't know what that. Tell me how you're thinking about hope right now.
Yeah, well, probably a good way to get into this was, we titled this "Hope in Exile," and I thought it might be good to just take a run at both of those major words, exile and hope. And I think the pandemic has been and is an experience of exile, but so also is the overdue national reckoning with race. Many of us are finding out that we don't live in the country we thought we lived in, that there's another story about race that some of us who are white, most of us who are white, didn't get taught. And so our country looks different. I think ultimately it looks more hopeful, but it's disorienting for a lot of people. And then, we've got this election coming up, and I keep hearing people say, regardless of where they fall on that, but that they don't recognize their country anymore. Mm-hmm. So this year has put exile into high relief, but there are people who feel in exile for other reasons. They find themselves in unfamiliar circumstances or unwelcoming circumstances. They're separated, isolated. I thought over and over again about those people who had to die alone, or who had to say goodbye to a loved one who was dying without being able to be present with that person. That's an experience of exile. Anytime we feel like we're not at home. And by the way, I want to say feeling at home is not the same thing as being at your house, because while we hope that most people feel at home with the people who are in their house, we also have family that's not part of the group that lives in that house. We talk about a church family and a church home, and friends at work who are like family, so there's been this sense of separation from people who are important to it. Aloneness, loneliness, all these are experiences of exile. Illness can be an experience of exile, depending on what it does to you and where it puts you. So there's exile, and I'm going to talk later, I think, we'll see how the conversation goes, about Israel's exile, Judah's exile in particular, mid-century. Anyway, we'll talk about that. Then I'm going to talk about hope, but first, and some of you, you said you remember most of what I've said, so you will have heard me say this. Hope is not the same thing as optimism.
Right.
And that's hard to distinguish, especially in America. The Canadian theologian Douglas John Hall said about the United States that the United States is the officially optimistic society because we have a deep down belief that our ingenuity, our strength, our technology, our determination can overcome virtually anything. And that takes a positive form to a point, but it becomes negative when it denies reality. Mm-hmm. And there are religious forms that denial of reality that looks like optimism takes. It flows from Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking to Robert Schuller's The Power of Possibility Thinking to Word of Faith preachers who say if you just believe it and pray it hard enough, it will happen. And by the way, this is just an observation. Donald Trump's first wedding was performed by Norman Vincent Peale.
Really?
Peale's church is the church the Trump family is from. And so when we hear a reflection from him that all we have to do is stay positive and not let it get the best of us, that's an expression of optimism gone off the rails, in my view. Now, I want to give optimism its due. The people who've done research into emotional intelligence tell us that pessimists probably assess reality more accurately, but optimists are more likely to do something about reality because they believe they can. So pessimism may be more accurate. Optimism probably has more energy in it. The problem is when it crashes into reality, what then? And I would say that the what then is where you make room for hope. And we can talk more about hope as this unfolds.
Can I ask you a question right there? Because when you talk about optimism, I know I often say things like, it's all good.
It's all good, yeah.
And that's because I'm probably too optimistic. But I also root that a little bit in Julian of Norwich, is all will be well.
Yeah.
So where do you put that in the optimism, realism, the phrasing of Julian Norwich?
Well, but before she said that, she described her incredible suffering in the middle of what might have been another pandemic illness. And her affirmation that all shall be well was actually not it's all good. It was instead, some of it is absolutely terrible, and it will still be well, which is a little different than it's all good. Now, it's all good is a fine thing as long as it's all good.
Right.
But when it's not, that's when optimism. I was walking earlier today, and I was thinking optimism is a little bit like a planet or a satellite around the sun. There's no question, and the sun being hope, there's no question that the sun imparts some of its energy to the planet, the satellite that is optimism. But there's always a dark side to a planet or a satellite, but not to the sun. And so optimism is reluctant to face the dark side. it's intent on denying that there's a shadow side, a hard side, or
Yeah.
whatever. It only wants to live on the light side of the planet.
I was remembering a movie that I watched called Melancholia, the most depressing movie you'll ever watch.
Yes.
I don't know if you've seen it or not.
I have.
But what I loved
I
about
thought it was my life story, and then I watched it.
so what I liked about the movie, though, or what intrigued me about the movie, is things were gonna end poorly, and you knew that from the beginning. Those who were more optimistic about life didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
They just found themselves just distraught. It was those who had maybe the pessimistic or the realistic view of life that were more in the ability to say, see, I told you it was all terrible.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think in that too, though, I struggled to find some hope here and there. But I don't know. So I think I hear a lot about what you're saying about how it fits in with optimism can cause you not to ever look at the dark side. So when the dark side comes,
Yeah.
what happens?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm saying optimism does provide a lot of hope-like energy,
Yeah.
but it can't take you as far as hope because it eventually crashes into the reality it has denied.
Yeah.
You know, the little engine that could, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can, doesn't always get to say, I knew I could, I knew I could, I knew I could. Sometimes you can't.
Right. So I grew up, I think my parents were very encouraging, and I think I truly believed at some point that I could do anything I wanted to do. And it was and my kids Jake still gets mad at me because he wanted to be an NBA star. And I told him his mom's 5'4" and I'm 5'8". So chances are that wasn't going to happen, even though he's 6 feet.
Yeah.
So, but I think there's a sense here to, at what point do we to help ourselves understand that shadow side?
Yeah.
And without trying to depress everybody, but how do we say that there are some things we can't do? It just kind of goes against everything you were brought up to believe, I think.
Right. Yes. It often, and that's what I mean about America being kind of the United States of America, officially optimistic. You know, that's how we raise our kids, and we want them to believe that they can do whatever they want to, but we know we're lying to them, even when we tell them that, because none of us can do anything that we want to do. We all come with a DNA that, you know, leans us in one direction or another. I remember when I was playing high school football and recruited a little bit by Georgia Tech, I was scared to death because that meant I'd have to know math. And I'm terrible at math. So there was no way that I could go to Georgia Tech, even though they wanted me to believe you can do anything you want to do. Well, no, you can't.
You can't.
So, Myron Madden, a pastoral counselor of a kind of another generation of the Wayne Oates generation, he worked at New Orleans Baptist Hospital, directed their CPE program, said, it's not wise to fight the fix. Those things that are fixed in place, it's not wise to fight those. Save the energy for struggle for an area where you can actually grow.
That's nice. Let me ask this question that was written on our chat. Is it possible that pessimism, realism, optimism is a continuum?
Yes. No question.
Okay.
No question. And I personally don't like the words pessimism and optimism, but they're the ones that get used in the literature. So I think it does have to do with realism and aspiration, because optimism at its best is about the energy for aspiration, determination. So we know that in the experience of the covenant people of Israel and Judah, what we commonly think of as the Jewish people, there were two major crises that occurred after King David, at various times, sometime a long time after King David. In the northern kingdom, known as Israel, uh, whose capital was in Samaria. The northern kingdom was conquered by Assyria in 722 BCE. For about 20 years before that, people had been being deported into Assyrian exile. When Samaria was conquered, Samaria itself became a place of exile for the Jews. So that's the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom lasted a lot longer. But in 587 BCE, Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, the southern kingdom was called Judah, was conquered by Babylon. And in the conquering of Judah, there was a destruction of Jerusalem. So remember, this is where the temple was, and the temple was reduced to rubble. The walls of Jerusalem, which they believed to be impregnable because it was God's city, fell. The leading citizens, the poorest of the poor, were left in Jerusalem, but the leading citizens and what we would think of as the middle class were all taken into exile into Babylon, and that exile lasted 70 years or so. There are two prophets. I mean, by the way, I think almost the whole Hebrew Bible, the whole Old Testament, reflects the perspective of the exile, because it was during the exile that the people who put the final touches on the Old Testament Hebrew Bible started putting the final touches on it. So anyway, there are two prophets in particular that I want to pay attention to. One is Jeremiah, and the other is Ezekiel, because they both had ministries of encouragement to the exiles in Babylon in different ways. So you all are familiar with Jeremiah 29. It's Jeremiah's famous letter to the exiles in Jerusalem, encouraging, and he wrote it early in the exile, encouraging them to, as he put it in Jeremiah 29, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat what they produce, take wives and have sons and daughters, take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters, multiply there and do not decrease. Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Jeremiah said to the exiles, you're there for a while. This is going to last longer than you imagined. It's going to be harder than you thought. And you have a choice. You can believe the lying prophets. And by the way, in Jeremiah 29, Jeremiah 28, Jeremiah describes the lying prophets. You can believe the lying prophets who tell you, don't worry, it's going to be over soon. And you can trust in them. But God says, I didn't send those people. They're not telling you the truth. The truth is, this exile is going to last longer and be harder than you thought. So here's what you need to do. You need to make life in exile. Whatever's possible, you need to make life in exile. And some of it is ordinary life. Plant gardens, tend to your family, do the ordinary things of life as much as possible. So I've kind of laughed about, people learning to make sourdough bread and cooking more at home, and putting together puzzles and, telling stories. These are gestures of ordinary life to try to make something more constructive out of exile. But then Jeremiah says, also what I want you to do is seek the welfare of the whole city. Now remember, these people in this city that Jeremiah tells them to seek the welfare of are their captors. They are their enemies. They are the people who have brought them there. And Jeremiah says, seek their welfare too, because it is in the welfare of all people that you find your welfare. And so in other words, do ordinary life and seek the common good, even the common good of people who you think of as your enemies. It's a very Jesus-like thing to say, seek the welfare of the people who took you captive. because you can't flourish if they don't. Your garden can't grow if it doesn't rain on theirs too. Um, so, um, so the question is then, where does the energy for that come from? Where does the energy for doing ordinary life when you're exhausted, or you're lonely, or you're afraid? Where does the energy for that ordinary life come from? And here's what he says later in chapter 29. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans for your welfare and not for harm, to give you a future with hope. Then when you call upon me and come and pray to me, I will hear you. When you search for me, you will find me if you seek me with all of your heart. Now that little phrase, I know the plans for you, plans for a future and a hope, you know, they appear on graduation cards, they appear on all kinds of things. And okay. But what this was about really is, it's going to be long, it's going to be hard, it's not going to last forever, and it's not impossible, because I have a plan for you. And the plan is hope. My plan is hope. It's not that I have a hopeful plan. My plan is to give you hope. And there's no avoiding that in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, hope is ultimately a gift we receive because we have a faithful God, a God who doesn't give up on us, even when we are in exile, or when we're in the wilderness, or when we're in bondage in Egypt, or when we're sick. We have a God who refuses to give up. Now, that God doesn't always act quickly, and that God doesn't always act in the ways we hope, but God acts to give us a hopeful, the plan is to give us hope. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I'm trying to get my mind around what hope feels like, or I think in exile a lot of people feel the hopelessness, and this is what Jeremiah is trying to encourage them.
Yeah.
How does it not become a superficial hope? Or
well, yeah. So I think this is true about other virtues of the Christian life. Love being one, faith being another.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that it's a feeling first.
Okay.
I think it may be a risky discipline and practice first. It is the risk of trusting that what we say we believe, what we say is true, is actually true, even though we can't prove it. So Annie Dillard wrote about this. She said, the Hasidic Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav noticed that if dancers could persuade a melancholy person to join them, if dancers could compel a melancholy person to join them, his sadness would lift. And if you are that melancholy person, he taught, persuade yourself to dance. For it is an achievement to struggle and pursue that sadness until you bring it into joy. Persuade yourself to dance. You don't feel like dancing to start with. You persuade yourself to dance. And then she adds this, which I just think is beautiful. In 1903, this is in Russia, and in 1903, Russia passed a number of laws that hobbled the Jews. They were called the hobbling laws. This same Rabbi Nachman said, I have danced a lot this year, by which he meant I've had to persuade myself to act in faithfulness to this hope that I have, even though I don't feel it. I'm dancing my way toward feeling it. Hope is a discipline and a gift. And thankfully, there are moments, we just can't predict when they will come, of reassurance that includes our feelings.
That's good. I think that gets into Barbara Brown Taylor and something she said this weekend, said, anticipatory hope is not enough anymore. participatory hope is the only kind that works now.
Yeah.
She says, I want cleats, not ruby slippers.
I love that. That's great.
And I think that's an interesting way to look at it. The participatory nature of it all, it sounds like what I'm hearing from you leads into it, not
Right. Right.
not
Leads into the feeling.
You lead into the feeling
the
of it.
experience
Right.
of it. Yeah. Yeah.
That's good.
And so to just quickly go to, because I want us to leave time to talk, quickly go to Ezekiel. So Jeremiah talks to people that he perceives to be capable still of planting gardens and, giving sons and daughters in marriage and seeking the welfare of the city. By contrast, Ezekiel chapter 37 perceives the exile, and this comes from later in the exile, so things have ground on and on and on, just like Jeremiah said they would. Ezekiel perceives that the exile has brought about a kind of death. And so he envisions the exiles as a valley of dry bones. We're all familiar with this story of the valley of dry bones. It's later in exile, and it's had a corrosive effect. By the way, we're not even a year into this yet, and I'm sensing the corrosive effects of this. We had our optimistic approaches early in this pandemic, and we're going to make the most of this, can do whatever. Now I'm hearing people say, I'm exhausted, I don't know what else to do, something's got to change. So anyway, Ezekiel wrote to people who were feeling like that. And by the way, Ezekiel is an odd and eccentric person, to say the least. The rabbis would not allow anyone under 30 to read Ezekiel because they thought it was too confusing. And y'all may have heard me say Ezekiel would be shelved these days with the Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia. It's that kind of book. Ezekiel called himself a prophet and a priest. And I'm persuaded that if he were a candidate for priesthood today, any ordination council would turn him down, because he would have to say, I see visions and I hear voices and I see dead people. and he'd get turned aside. So anyway, in Ezekiel 37, the very first thing that God has Ezekiel do, this is in verse 2, the very first thing God has Ezekiel do is walk among the dead bones that he sees. This may seem like a strange place to go for hope, but walking among the things that have died, in other words, lingering over our losses, lamenting them, giving voice to what isn't anymore, makes room in us for something else. Right now, a lot of us are clogged with unshed tears, unexpressed losses, unnamed disappointments, and that's clogging up the passageways. So I'm thinking individually and corporately, we need to do a lot more lamenting.
Yes.
A lot more grieving, and it sounds counter hope, but actually it's an opening move for hope. So anyway, Ezekiel walks among the bones, and I can imagine, him, his own grief at experiencing the grief of others. And then you all know the story. I don't need to go into great detail, but God asked Ezekiel, can these bones live again? And Ezekiel rightly says, I have no idea. Only you know whether they can live again. And God says, well, preach to these bones. And in a sense, that's where we are. We're dealing with each other who feel like so much has died. And we're trying to find what words, what truths do people in whom so much has died need to hear? So preach to the bones and say, and preach to the spirit and the breath and the wind. It's all one word. And watch what happens. And Ezekiel does that, and the bones reassemble and flesh covers the bones, and what was a valley of dry bones becomes a congregation a nation again. The reason I wanted to point that out is Jeremiah sounds a little bit like, you can do this. It's going to be hard. It's going to be long. You can do this, though. And sometimes that's where we are. In fact, I think a lot of upper middle class people have suffered some, but for the most part, our suffering doesn't compare to people who are on the margins, who don't have access to the kind of care they need, who are forced to do work so that the rest of us can benefit. Those people are really suffering. And for them, this is not like plant gardens, build houses, do the best you can. This is, I'm dying here or I'm dead here. And is there any hope for exile when you're on the verge of death? And Ezekiel says yes. But the hope is in, frankly, a resurrecting move of God's breath and spirit. So I wanted to offer both of those, both to the exiles, both by faithful prophets, one early and one late. And you can see that what we need to hear and practice changes based on where we are, what our circumstances.
Well, I want to pick up two things that were separated, I think, and this comes from one of the questions. We talked about don't fight the fix, but find those areas of growth, and we talked about resurrection.
Right. Yeah.
Which the question was, how do we know what's fixed? It sure feels like sexism, homophobia, white supremacy, and greed-based capitalism feel awfully fixed at times. But you also talked about maybe hope for those who are most marginalized and needing to experience resurrection. Can you pull those? Maybe they're not separate, but they feel a little bit distinct in my mind. How do those pull together?
Well, almost anything in my mind, almost anything that ends with the suffix ism is not fixed. It may be entrenched. It may seem immovable, but this is oversimplification. People agreed on a set of stories and assumptions that constructed all of those isms. We put them in place, and now we've practiced them long enough, they feel like they're fixed. But I believe it's possible. This is my hopeful. I believe it's possible that if the stories we've told ourselves and the assumptions we've made put those isms in place, new stories and better assumptions can help to dismantle them. It's not going to be easy, and it's a long process. When I was talking about not fighting the fixed, I was thinking more about the individual,
right,
who often what we want. This is kind of so I make a distinction between human nature and the human condition. The human nature was made good. Human condition is what we do with the human nature. And in the human condition, there seems to be this thing kind of turned in us that makes us want the very thing we can't have and not enjoy the things that we do have. To put it in modern management terms, there's a difference between strength finders working with your strengths and trying to overcome your weaknesses. And so what I'm saying is, those things that we think of as weaknesses may just be fixed elements of our personality. Why not see what's possible if we go with the grain of how we're made instead of against the grain of how we're made?
Yeah.
I don't know if that helps or not.
Yeah, and it made me think to Ron Rolheiser's quote, "Desire is always stronger than satisfaction."
Yes.
And that we were never really satisfied. Our hearts are restless. To use that language, until we can find rest in God. And I think a lot of that has to do with recognizing who God has created us to be.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, it's the journey to home is the journey to God, and the journey to God is the journey to self. which is again the journey home. No surprise, you've already quoted me on saying this, but I think it's just we don't hear enough that our essential identity as God's children is secure in God's love.
Yes.
And no matter what happens, our identity as God's beloved children, in whom God takes great delight, does not change. That's not up to us. That's a gift given to us by God that not even death takes away. In fact, death may be a gateway toward fuller realization of what it means to be a child of God in whom God takes great delight. And so I think it's hope nourishing to remember who you are, to remember who you truly are. And then the other thing I would say, you all won't be surprised that, I only have one or two sermons, and I teach them in various ways over and over again. So the other thing I'll say is that Paul's concluding word in Romans 8 is true. Nothing in all creation shall be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Note that word separation. Nothing will be able to keep us in exile because of the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Doesn't mean you don't go into exile. It doesn't mean you don't experience all those things that threaten hope. But it does mean that those things don't separate us finally from the love of God.
Guy.
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Bill.
I
Hey.
really appreciate so much you're talking about our story. I'm reading a book now, The Indigenous History of the United States. I'm taking part in a book talk next week, but it's like we're hearing a lot about that we're trying to change the story, and
Right.
I feel like when I think of the sense of hope, I'm seeing that it's like it seems like things are getting worse, but I'm having hope that it's really turning towards the better, but that's going to take time in this period of exile.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're saying too, that it's going to take time, but with all this that's going on in our country right now, that there's going to be a turn for the better with the story?
Yeah, I don't, thank you, Bill. I don't think it'll be automatic. We're going to have to work at it. But, this may seem paradoxical. I think it's simultaneously getting worse and getting better. It's getting worse because it's getting better. There are people who don't want it to get better, who don't want the story to change. They have an investment in the old story. And so not the old story, the old stories that give rise to the ism, and they want to keep those in place, and we shouldn't doubt that. There were dark forces that put a lot of that in place, and they're not going to let go of it quickly. It's also true, I think, that I see more people paying attention to alternative stories, just like what you're doing, than ever before, and those have power. They're like the parables of Jesus. They have power. They kind of blow up on people in a good way and show them a different world.
It's painful. I'm finding that it's painful when you're confronted with what you probably have realized inside, but you are now taking the time to read that story from a different perspective. And that's not for a lot of us, but we don't want to see that because it hurts.
It does hurt. It does hurt, and for me to learn that even though I tried to be a nice, polite white person in the South, that doesn't begin to be enough. That doesn't begin to be enough, because those systems stay in place no matter how nice I am, and it doesn't force me to face how I internalize that. I may have told you all, I don't know if I have told you, when I was teaching at Mars Hill, I was teaching Christian ethics and U.S. culture, and I had my students read Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, and I'd read it and reread it, all that, but I was reading it with them, And, Dr. King says his biggest trouble is with the white moderate churchman in the South. Because the white moderate church person wants to go slow. We agree with your goals, but go slow. But here's what blew me away. He talked about his daughter, who was my age, not being able to go to an amusement park on the south side of Atlanta called Funtown. And when I read that this time, I thought, oh my gosh, I grew up going to Funtown. Mm-hmm. And I never noticed, this is to my shame, I never noticed that the only Black people there were employees. So it doesn't matter how nice I am. If I leave in place a system where Bernice King can't go to Funtown, but I can. So anyway, I'm getting way off topic.
No, that's good. Others?
Hi, Tommy.
Hey, how are you, Sandra?
I am well, thank you. And I am going to say what I probably shouldn't be asking. In the moderate Protestant churches, is there going to be more guidance in seeking out the systemic stuff and dealing with it, or not?
Well, let me just say from my perspective, Sandra, and I don't really, well, I'm just going to say from my perspective, First Baptist is making a real effort to learn about those systems that are in place. And it's a long process there as well, for people to unlearn and learn. And so I think it's happening. The problem is most of us are playing catch up.
Sure.
We're catching up, and it's hard to go as fast as the culture needs us to go, because these things are not just ideas; they're visceral feelings and patterned ways of acting. But from my perspective, First Baptist is giving it a real try, a real effort.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And that involves, for us, communication with the city officials, with the community that's really right across the church from us, in Martin Luther King Jr. Park area. It takes a lot of conversation, as you said, a lot of conversation, a lot of time. But I think there's movement, I'll say, and I hope it's not too slow. I hope we can move more quickly than we have in the past. And again, a lot of that's learning these new stories, asking questions, being curious, hearing the history that maybe we didn't even know.
And I don't mean this just to bring it back to the theme, but I find it hopeful that we're asking each other these kinds of questions. I've been at this a long time now, and I don't remember being asked, are we going to go deeper, faster, to confront things that we know are wrong? In fact, I've been asked contrary questions.
And I think, Guy, at least for me, and this is hard for me, I like things to be very harmonized and Enneagram 9 here. So, So I find myself wanting to get it all right before we ever try something, because I don't want to be offensive in any way. So that's where you can get too nice too, I think, is I don't want to say the wrong things or do the wrong things, but I think it's going to take some risk on all of our parts to be, that I might actually offend somebody, but through that I can also learn.
You may remember that I'm an Enneagram 9 as well. And the world we wish existed never did, but it certainly doesn't now.
Yes.
And there's no way to do what we need to do individually and collectively without all of us being uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Okay,
Yeah.
another question?
I can't remember sitting here
Oh, Terry.
who said this quote, but it's one that stuck with me. And the quote was, one of the best ways to find hope is to become hope to someone else.
Yeah.
And activism side, that's the ism, getting out of the ism side. But you'll have to pull me along. You talk about Enneagram, it's Enneagram 5. I want to think about it a long time before I do it.
Yeah.
Yes.
It reminds me that, and this is something we don't need to pursue, but Jürgen Moltmann, kind of the pioneer of what was called the theology of hope, said that hope takes essentially two forms. It takes the form of comfort, but it also takes the form of protest. So think of hope as a form of mercy or comfort. When we're wounded, someone helps bind up our wounds. Hope as protest says, we got to stop what wounds people. And that's what Terry is saying is become hope for somebody else, help to comfort them, but also help to change the conditions that they're in. And it is true that when we act in harmony with hope, we become more hopeful ourselves. That's that persuading yourself to dance again.
Deering, you had a question?
Yeah. So as I'm listening, I'm hearing a couple of like practices from what we've been talking about. I guess I've heard like lamenting personally and collectively, like allowing that grief. And then the other thing that I wrote down was like, it's hopeful and nourishing to remember who you are.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious if there are other things, either one of you, just daily practices that you find bring a deep sense of hope to the day itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, for me, Deering, and it's good to see you, by the way. For me, there's a sense in which, and it sounds very ordinary, but there's a sense in which being grounded in Scripture, because it gives me another perspective than the one my anxieties are likely to produce, and offering up myself and other people to God's light, praying for them. It's amazing how that can release hope, hope, and hopefully not just for us, but for other people. I also think that, Bill was reminding us about the power of telling stories, and Native Americans in particular know what great power there is in stories. I think it's really good to make time to hear one another's stories, especially stories of adversity and how we came through it. A lot of people have struggled and we don't know their stories. And we've struggled and other people don't know our stories. So I think that those are some things, and getting outside, outside ourselves, but also outside the building. I don't know about you all. I imagine it's true. I have just noted over and over again the contrast. We're anxiety driven about pandemic, racial reckoning, and election, and we should be. I don't think we can help it. But I'm looking out the window at the French Broad River. It's not anxious at all.
That's right.
And that's helpful. So I don't know if that helps at all, Deering, but those are some things.
You.
Yeah, and I agree completely with Guy. He listed several of mine. I always think of the word vulnerability in the storytelling, because I think we can craft a story to make it safe for us, but I think people need to hear our vulnerabilities in those stories too, so that we can say, yeah, this is where I'm struggling too, or this is where I'm not even. I found that some people want to hear my good stories and not always my bad stories.
Right.
And so with that, I think one of the practices that I don't, it's not a practice necessarily. I just have a family who makes me laugh a lot. So finding opportunities to laugh and play when there's a tendency to just be serious.
Yeah.
If we can find those opportunities, I think it's important to take them.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to read the second part because it's long. The second part of Wendell Berry's Manifesto, the Mad Farmer Liberation poem. And where he says practice resurrection, you can just plug in practice hope. So friends, every day do something that won't compute. Love the Lord, love the world, work for nothing. Take all that you have and be poor. Love someone who does not deserve it. Denounce the government and embrace the flag. Hope to live in that free republic for which it stands. Give your approval to all you cannot understand. Praise ignorance. For what man has not encountered, he has not destroyed. Ask the questions that have no answers. Invest in the millennium. Plant sequoias. Say that your main crop is the forest that you did not plant, that you will not live to harvest. Say that the leaves are harvested when they have rotted into the mold. Call that profit. Prophesy such returns. Put your faith in the 2 inches of humus that will build under the trees every 1,000 years. So I love that. Practice resurrection, plant sequoias, invest in the long term. That it takes hope to do that. And by the way, just before we get into rapid fire, point of honesty that may touch on vulnerability. Everything I have said hinges on my daily practice of praying. I trust, help my lack of trust. I believe, help my unbelief. These things I have just said, I believe to be true. I can't always lean into the trust that makes them part of my experience. And so I have to pray for that as well. It's not easy.
Wow. Well, I'm grateful for your time with us today. I'm thankful for your wisdom and your hopefulness that you share with us today. So I know everybody here is feeling the same thing. So only because we've been doing this, we could probably wrap up now, but I am just curious of these rapid fire questions.
Okay.
So they're not hard.
I'm curious about what they are.
And they're not even overly creative, but your answers may be creative. So, I mean, the first one is, so what book are you reading right now that you're finding meaning in?
What book am I reading right now that I'm finding meaning in? I am reading, you and I talked about this one the other day. I'm reading Willie James Jennings' After Whiteness.
Yes, beautiful book.
About theological education. I'm finding that really helpful.
Mm-hmm. I love it. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, it's okay.
Sorry. So I don't know if you do this or not, but are you binge watching anything?
Lord, yes, I've been binge watching. I watched every episode of Endeavor I could find. It's a PBS series.
Yeah.
And, we're dosing ourselves on watching. Now I've forgotten what. It's a Netflix drama about the trip to Mars. Away.
Oh, don't know that one. Okay, I'll have to take that one.
Yeah.
Excellent. You kind of joked about this earlier with the bread, but what have you created during pandemic? What is something you've created?
What have I created? I'm tempted to be very pious, but actually refer it to Dr. Groh. I've created a new heart.
Yes. I think that's.
I haven't really created anything new. I did redo my website. My tech guy and I redesigned my website.
Excellent. And what is that website? Where can people find you?
FromTheIntersection.org.
Excellent. So this will just be your final question. So what is the one thing you're looking forward to most when everybody is able to gather back together safely?
Congregational singing.
Yeah. Me too. I like to sing loud and sometimes on key.
I mean, it's a toss up between communion and congregational singing.
Yeah. Well, blessings.
Yeah.
But thank you all for joining us, and we're gonna have theological conversations from time to time, and you'll see those on our church website and or our e-newsletter. So I hope that you join in anytime. So yeah, claps to Guy. Thank you.
Thank you.